In Orkney, we used to have an expression, "I'll be Ower with the moon," meaning that I would come and visit you when the moon is full to light my way. Hello folks, and welcome to another episode of Ower with the Moon. This month, we've not gone anywhere. We're just sitting here in our library, aren't we?
Appropriately for winter, we're just kind of hunkered down. And
Aye, fire's on.
going.
Mm-hmm. Pour a dram, because it is, well...
It's dreich.
It's dreich. Mm-hmm. And the sun's over the yardarm somewhere in the world anyway.
But isn't this just the time of year when people would be talking about the old stories?
This is exactly the time that people would gather together and tell the tales. And the one thing that people from the Nordic world were particularly fond of was tales of their ancestors. And if they were listening to a story, if one of their ancestors was mentioned, then it would be like their ears would prick up and they would come alive, you know. Because it was meaningful to them. The whole thing of kin was very important. You had to know who your kin were. And it was something that was very prevalent when my mother, who came from Westrian, was born in 1922. And she would say to me, kind of like, oh, it's important. You got to kin who your family are, you know, your relations. And as a young person, it doesn't mean that much to you. Family trees and such like. But it was only when I started reading Icelandic sagas that you realise that this is an extremely Nordic thing. Mm. Knowing your kin, redding up your kin, as they used to call it here, where you got your family tree put in order, redding it up. To red is just to tidy up, clean up. And so you were basically putting your family tree in order. And that is what people listening to sagas do, because generally sagas are about people. It's, you know, there are exceptions, but usually it's families. So it's the story of a family or a person.
Mm. And our listening friends may or may not realize, depending on how much they know about Orkney today, that Orkney is steeped in Nordic culture.
Well, we're part of Norway for longer than we've been part of Scotland. And the culture goes way back. I mean, part of Norway. We were part of Norway when it suited the earls, or the jarls, I should call them, actually, because that is the term that they would have used here as a jarl. It's equivalent to an earl. Yeah. But yeah, they were very much independent. I mean, Orkney was an extremely important power base in the Nordic world. It sat at that cultural crossroads between the Celtic world and the Scandinavian world. Mm. From bases here, you could raid down the east coast of Scotland and England, or you could just turn right at the Pentonforth and head off down to the Western Isles and Ireland and Wales even.
And they did.
And they did. And England as well. England was raided by. So, I mean, it was, there are stories about the Earls of Orkney being involved in raids in all of these places. Mm. So it was an important and powerful area. So the Jarls of Orkney were actually powerful people.
So how did they keep track of all their genealogies and their stories and everything? It wasn't just a verbal passing down?
Oh, yeah, very much. Mm-hmm. It was passed down orally from generation to generation. It was only sort of in the 1200s that they started being written down in Iceland. And I mean, a lot of sagas are lost, including, I mean, we have our own one, Orkneyinga Saga. The original Orkneyinga Saga is lost.
What does Orkneyinga mean?
It means the people of Orkney.
Yeah.
But it's actually the story of the jarls. And there was an earlier Jarla Saga, which was the story of the jarls of Orkney. And some of the jarls may have had their own individual sagas as well, which have been lost.
Tragic.
So somewhere around 1200, the Orkneyinga Saga was written down by somebody in Iceland. We don't know who the author was. Generally, these things were done. It tended to be, not necessarily strictly always, of course, but it tended to be clerics, people involved with the church, because they were literate.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, in Iceland, there became this really important medieval culture of writing down the stories, collecting the stories, writing them down. And that is unique. There's nothing else really quite like it.
So do we have Iceland to thank for all of the sagas?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you, Iceland.
No, absolutely. No, it's... I mean, there were some stories obviously recorded in other areas as well, but I mean, nothing like what happened in Iceland. They were writing stories about people. I mean, we can't actually name people who wrote sagas, with the exception of a man called Snorri Sturluson, who wrote not only sagas, he wrote the Prose Edda, which is a collection of stories about the gods, the old gods, which is quite incredible because, I mean, the man was a Christian, as everybody in Iceland was at that time. But there was a great love there of the old gods. There was a cleric in Denmark called Saxo Grammaticus that was writing around the same time, about 1200. And he also wrote stories of the gods as well, but they were very, very heavily spun by Christianity. So these people were, con men from the south. And I mean, Snorri does actually kind of reflect that as well, and that is put into it, that the gods were not really gods, they were just sorcerers, and basically great leaders, great warriors and all, but who portrayed themselves as gods.
So with that proviso, they could then go on and just tell the stories.
Yeah. So that's why Snorri, but I mean, the difference between Saxo and Snorri is that Saxo is very dismissive of the whole thing. And
which one is that?
He's the Danish one, Saxo Grammaticus. So he's judging the gods by his own beliefs in Christianity. So they're being dismissed as, not that important. Whereas Snorri, on the other hand, is talking about the gods in quite a sort of a much more playful way, and also much more familiar and far more friendly terms. He may not believe in them, but he loves the stories, and the love of the stories shines through in his work.
Like Tolkien.
Yeah. And I mean, if it wasn't for Snorri, then Tolkien would have had quite a few problems. And Icelandic sagas in general. I mean, the Volsung saga of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, that all comes back to an earlier story that Snorri also records of a magic ring being stolen from a dwarf by the god Loki and being cursed.
Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, and then in the German terms, then you get things like cloaks of invisibility, and and so it's all wrapped up in there. But also he had lists, Snorri had lists of names of elves and dwarves. And among the list of dwarves, there is Balin and Dwalin and Owe and Glowy and Nori and Dory and Biffer and Bomber and
Isn't Gimli one of them as well?
Gimli's in there too, and so is Gandalf.
Oh, that's right.
Gandalf is actually on the list of dwarves. So, yeah, that's where the influence came from.
Yeah. And that's an honor that even people today writing today are borrowing heavily from some of these wonderful old
Oh, yeah,
tales.
absolutely. But it all kind of goes back to there. And if Snorri hadn't written down those stories, then maybe they would have been lost.
How many of the sagas are there still today?
Oh, God, I really couldn't tell you. I mean...
Which ones do you know about?
Well, you see that 2 shelves, 3 shelves, actually.
Different.
Those are all sagas.
All different sagas or some repeats.
The Orkneyinga Saga, I have all the editions, all the different translations. But there was a collection that I bought in Iceland about 20 years ago called Saga of the Icelanders. And it's all the sagas of the Icelandic families. And there are dozens of them.
Mm.
So, yeah, there's a lot. And some are great epic long ones and some are short.
Where, if somebody was interested in just dipping their toes in without a whole lot of foreknowledge about how these things work, is there one that you would recommend to start with that's maybe more story-like and less genealogy heavy? Or
Volsung Saga is a good one because it is mythical. There are mythical sagas as well. And that is a magic story about, slaying a dragon and there's elements in it which are you find in Celtic stories as well. When he kills the dragon Fafnir, because this man, Regan, has made him a sword that is going to be strong enough for him to use, this young guy. Regan is actually Fafnir's brother, because Fafnir turned himself into a dragon to guard the treasure hoard, which was cursed by the dwarf, because it had the ring. And he hides in a pit. Dragon goes down to the stream to take a drink every day, and Sigurd stabs him in his soft underbelly and kills him. But then Regan wants him to cut out the heart and roast it over the fire. And he wants to eat it. And so he's told not to touch it, not to eat any bit of it.
yes, this is sounding familiar.
And then he conveniently goes to sleep. And Sigurd is roasting the heart over the fire. And he kind of gives it a little poke to see how it's doing. And some of the blood spurts out, hot blood spurts out on his finger. And he goes, ooh, and puts his finger in his mouth automatically. And can understand the language of the birds in the trees above him, who are having a laugh at him, saying, Regan's going to kill him, and take all the treasure for himself. So he kills Regan before he gets a chance. And but then he goes on to marry a Valkyrie, and there's all sorts of, there's lots of double dealings and stuff. It makes Game of Thrones look like a kind of a nursery book, But it's a good read.
Volsung Saga?
Volsung Saga. So that's a good one. But meanwhile, to get back to Snorri, who's been parked for a wee while, he wrote the Prose Edda. He also wrote Heimskringla, which is an extremely important collection of technically you could say it's not a saga because it's a history of the kings of Norway.
Mm.
But fabulous read, and we'll say more about that later. But it's also thought that he wrote Egil Saga because he lived in the area where Egil Skallagrimsson came from, who was a sort of psychopathic poet.
Like your Viking name, Eagle. It's Eagle, right?
Egil, yeah.
Egilsea in Orkney is
that's right.
Eagle Island.
Yeah, it's named after somebody.
So what's your Viking name?
Oh, Christ, must you drag up?
I want to know. I want everyone to know.
Well, I was given a Viking name in Sweden when I used to hang out in the 10th century, and it was Egil Bragi, because Egil was a poet as well as being a bit of a psycho. Yeah. And Bragi is the Nordic god of poetry. Along with Odin. Odin is also a god of poetry, but there was Bragi was god of poetry. But Egil Skallagrimsson from the Borgarnes area in Iceland, where Hjörleifur Helgi Stephenson comes from. So my pet Viking, who was on a few episodes ago, talking about Icelandic folk tales and such like. So Egil was from that area. And so it's quite likely, we don't know for certain, but it is quite likely that Snorri wrote that saga, because he was writing sagas at Reykholt, at his home. And, it would make sense, because it was the local saga of the guy who's was the chieftain of that area at one time. Very powerful, very important guy. Mm. And some great stories in there as well, But Orkneyinga Saga, we don't know who wrote that. But it's thought to be written around 1200. And it tells the story of the jarls of Orkney, and also some of the chieftains as well comes into the story too.
We thought today for this session, we thought we would talk mainly about pre-medieval Vikings.
This is the pagan jarls of Orkney. So this takes us up from the early days, according to the saga, 784, but it isn't. Sorry, edit up. 874, I mean. It takes us from the period 874, although it would be much earlier than that, because, well, we'll get to that when we get to that. But it takes us up to the year 1014, to be precise, the
Battle of Clontarf.
23rd of April, 1014, Battle of Clontarf, or Brian Boru's battle, as it's known in Icelandic sagas. So, but the saga begins with a mythological beginning, the origins of the jarls of Orkney, who are descended from a man called Rogvald of Mura in Norway. And he was second in power only to King Harald Finehair. And the story of Harald Finehair, which doesn't really come into Orkneyinga Saga, but it kind of does and it kind of doesn't. But he went wooing a woman called Gerda, who was very, very beautiful, and she was the daughter of King Eric of Hordaland. And he sent a messenger to ask her if she would marry him. And she says, "Go away and tell your master that I won't marry him until he is king of all of Norway, the same as King Eric of Sweden or King Gorm of Denmark is king of the whole country." So she kind of thought, well, that got rid of him. But Harold says, well, this has been on my mind for some time, because they'd said, why don't you just go and grab her and carry her off?
The old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
Talking, asking.
Henry VIII would have called the rough wooing.
Oh.
But he said, no, I have been thinking about that as well, and she's got a point. And he made this promise, this vow that he would neither cut or comb his hair until he had unified all of Norway under his control. And he starts fighting with all the regional kings and killing them, or they would surrender, and he would put them in as a jarl over the area that they used to be king of. He took the title of king. Now, a lot of this is mythology as well as story. I mean, was there really a gore? Did that happen? But he did unify Norway under his control. King Eric of Hordaland, Gerda's father, ended up being killed by him, so it was kind of backfired slightly on her, but, well, depending on whether she liked him, I suppose. But he becomes King of Norway, and the last big battle is at Havsfjordur near Stavanger, and that was in 874. But then, according to Orkneyinga Saga, in the same year, he leads a huge expedition west against Vikings that have fled Norway and gone to live in Orkney and Shetland. And so he leads a huge army of, a big fleet across the sea to subdue the islands. Now, why the hell would he do that if he had just unified a country? That is very, very unstable. There's a lot of people with a great deal of resentment because they were in charge of their own affairs, and then suddenly they've got this guy taking over and being king over them. They didn't like it one little bit. He would not have left the country. Also, there is no mention of this anywhere in Britain. And there are things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, or there's the Annals of Ulster in Ireland that was kept as a record of things that happened that year. And it was very, very brief, but there is absolutely no mention of a big expedition by a Norwegian king across to Britain. It's probably been copied from an expedition that happened much later in 1098 when King Magnus Barelegs led a fleet over and did all the things that it claims that it's attributing to Harold. But it's probably just kind of made up to justify how Rogvald of Mora was made the Earl of Orkney, and his descendants were the jarls. Because
so he didn't actually leave Norway, you don't think?
No, he didn't. Definitely didn't.
And how did he get control here?
Probably because they just grabbed it. There was the king gave him the title of jarl, That probably didn't happen. It was just taken over.
So the people that came over here and took it over from the Picts, were they on their own, or were they kind of doing it as Norwegians with this Harold or whatever his name was? Who are we talking about that was the leader at this time? Many names.
Harold Fairhair. After he had won, the country, it was Rogvald of Mora that cut and combed his hair. And he was known before that as Harold Thickhair, because he was sort of like matted and, a bit of a mess. But then when they saw how beautiful his hair was, when it was all washed and combed, and Rogvald gave him the name of Harold Fairhair, not meaning fair as in blonde, but fair as in beautiful. So Mr. Pretty Hair.
So I'm still trying to figure out how the Vikings that came here and Shetland in particular, who were they? Were they just kind of rogues out? Did they want to leave Norway because they were disgruntled, or were they?
There were some people who did flee from Harold when he took the country over. A lot of them were, important chieftains or local kings that just thought, I'm not bending my knee to him or anyone. So they went off. And I mean, there've been raids launched against Norway from Orkney and Shetland. Some went further away and went to Iceland. There was quite a lot of that. It's in Landnama book, the book of settlements in Iceland. And so, but then there would have been a lot of people that just used it as a base, maybe. But that family weren't involved in that from the beginning. There was, other people here. And interestingly, so it's got nothing to do with sagas, isotopical analysis of the enamel on teeth from Viking graves in Orkney, it shows the strontium signature that is in all things because it comes from the rocks, basically. So it's in the water and it's in the grass. So if whatever water you're drinking, and if you kill an animal that has been eating grass, it's in that as well. So it shows you where you grow up in the world. And there is a lot of evidence now for people from the far north of Norway being among the early settlers here. So you're looking at Arctic Norway, not just sailing west from Hordaland or Rogaland, but actually coming up from the Trondernes, Tromsø area. So very far north. But the early part of Orkneyinga Saga deals with Rogvald of Mora's ancestors and who they were, because that sets the groundwork, which you wouldn't understand. And that's not being condescending. I wouldn't understand it.
Because
unless
you're not from that culture.
Well, not because you're not from that time.
Mm.
You're not an Icelander from 1200, because you would hear things and you would go, oh yeah, I get that. It's like, when you came over here from America, or when I watch American shows, like sort of Family Guy or something like that, they make references to people who are known in America, or when you're here, you get references to people that were known in Britain. But you've got no idea who they are, because it's just some person that's on TV over here or over there. It's the same thing if you were in a saga audience. You would hear a name and you'd go, ah, right, I get you. Because a lot of the names had meanings. And so you would understand, even if it's a mythical person. You would know what they were hinting at, what they were getting at.
So if somebody got into these sagas and really started studying, I wonder if maybe there would be sort of a web that would begin to shimmer among them, where you would start to understand and recognize names and places and the significance of things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But the story starts as a story. And it's interesting that the first 3 chapters, I think it is, of Orkneyinga Saga, is the mythological beginnings. And I remember Willie Thompson once, who was a very, very well-known, well-respected historian in Orkney, and the poor man had the misfortune of being the rector of Kirkwall Grammar School when I was supposed to be going there. I remember going to an evening class he held, and the look of horror on his face when me and Choice Gray walked in.
This
it was
years
like
later.
It was like all his nightmares.
After he'd gotten rid of you.
Yeah. He'd woken up screaming with this vision and during the night many a time, but he was a man I had a tremendous amount of respect for, because, he knew his subject, and he was a nice guy. But he said that if you could just skip those early chapters of Orkneyinga Saga and just go straight into the main story, a lot of people start reading that and they go, I have no idea what the hell all this is about.
Right.
And they give up. And it's a pity, because it's a really, really important starting point, but only if you understand what's going on. So to everybody that's just picking up and reading it, it's like, I really don't get that.
So maybe you would recommend skipping those first 3 chapters
No,
temporarily?
You don't have to. But it does get, more clearer after that. But you have to bear in mind, this is telling the story of a family of the jarls of Orkney, which covers over 300 years. And there is a lot of confusion because there's a lot of people that have the same name, because generally you got named after your parental grandfather. So there's a lot of people with the same names turning up. But in the story, there was a leader, a chieftain in the Northlands, maybe a king, descended from a king, it says, called Thori the Dry One. And he used to hold a sacrifice in midwinter. So in the Viking times, the midwinter month was named after him. And he would have a blut, as it's called, which is, it just means blood. And it's a sacrifice. It's a blood sacrifice for prosperity for the year ahead. Now, he had 2 sons, Nor and Gore, and he also had a daughter called Goi. And at one of these great sacrifices, Goi went missing. And no one knew where she was. So her brothers, Nor and Gore, set off in search for her. And Nor travelled throughout the land, on the mainland, and Gore set sail and sailed all around the Baltic and also up the west coast, around all the islands in Norway. And as they went, because Nor was going over land on skis, they kind of subdued the people that were there and brought it under their control. So they became the kings of those areas, of the mainland or the islands. Nor was the king of all of the mainland, which he named after himself, Norway. And Gore was a sea king who controlled all the islands. Now, they initially were unsuccessful. They couldn't find Goi. But eventually, it was Nor who found her. And she had been abducted by King Rolf. And he was the son of a giant called Svadi. So, of the race of giants. And Nor and Rolf fought in single combat for an entire day. And neither one of them got the upper hand over the other. They were both evenly matched. And so eventually they swore a pact of peace between them. It was agreed that Rolf could keep Goi as his wife, and Nor married Rolf's sister. So
they became family.
Yeah, that's what they did. I mean, and that's what kings did.
Peace.
You made a political match. You didn't marry for love. It was, we need this person on board, so we'll marry off my daughter to them, and then we'll all be one political unit. Blood was thicker than water. So that was the story, and then it said that Gore, the sea king, had 2 sons, Haiti and Baiti, who were, violent men, it was said. And it's Haiti that is supposed to be the ancestor of Rogwald of Moura. So these are the people that they are descended from. But when you go back further than that, the first person mentioned as an ancestor of these earls is King Forniot. And he had 3 sons. There was Ager, Logi, and Kari. And Kari had a son called Frosty. And Frosty had a son called Snare the Old. Presumably he got the nickname when he was older. No, not when he was newly born. And it was Snare the Old that was the father of Thori. So the sacrificer. So, that's all very fine. It's a list of names. It means nothing. But if you were a 13th century Icelander, you would go, because King Forniot, the name Forniot, appears in a list of giants' names that is in Snorri's Prose Edda. Mm. So they would know that he was not only a giant, but a rock giant. And that is associated as being like a nature spirit of being in, the land. The bones of the land were the stones, and the rock giants came from that. So they were like the bones of the place. His son Ager the name Ager is associated with water, and he was supposed to be either a sea god or a sea giant. Logi means flame or fire, and Kari was an old ancient name for the north wind. So you've got the elements. You've got the father is rock or earth. You've got Ager as water, Logi is fire, and Kari as wind. And Kari has a son called Frosty, who wasn't a snowman, but I'm sure you can guess.
I did think that, but I wasn't going to say anything.
I'm sure you can guess what the name means, though.
Snow?
Frosty.
Snow?
No.
Winter?
No.
Ice.
Frost.
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 Literally.
Literally, frost. And his son was Snare, which is...
Snow.
Snow,
oh.
Yeah.
Frosted snow.
So there you have got Rogvald of Moor's ancestors are descended from the Norwegian giants who are associated with the elements of the land in the far north. You have rock, you have water, you have flames, but from his direct line, you have the rock giant Forniot, you have Kari the north wind, Frosty the frost, Snare the snow, and then Thori, who worshipped specifically at midwinter. So they're all elements, but they're all about winter. They're all about the far north. They're about cold. Mm-hmm. Now, you might think, okay, so what? When Snorri wrote Heimskringla, the saga of the kings of Norway, he has the Aesir, which is a collective name for some of the gods. There was the Vanir and the Aesir. And the Aesir were led by Odin. They came from Asia, which is why they were Aesir.
From Asia?
Mm-hmm. That's what the story says.
Huh.
And Odin was a powerful sorcerer and a great leader in battle, a very ferocious man, but a good strategist. And people became so enamored with him that they thought they were gods because he was a sorcerer and he was successful in battle. So the gods are always fighting against their arch enemy, which is the giants. So the subtle undertone here is that Rogvald of Mora is more Norwegian than the king who claims descent from gods, because most of the kings in Norway claim descent from the god Frey, who was actually of the Vanir, the sort of gods of nature and magic. And he was known generally as Frey Yngvi. And from Yngvi, you get the Inglings, which is the name of the sort of royal family in Norway. So they claim descent from a god. And it's known that this god is supposed to be from like overseas and not really one of us. Whereas Rogvald, his ancestors, are the giants who are the enemies of the gods, but also who absolutely 100% Norwegian.
From the land itself, from nature itself.
And from the cold of the north, rather than the heat of the south. All of these things would have been recognizable to people. You know what you were getting at. Mm. You weren't saying it directly, but you were hinting it. So that kind of sets the background for Rogvald, who then sets out on this expedition with King Harald Finehair, who, I mean, he is his right-hand man. I mean, they're not rivals. Rogvald's done rather good out of this because he's been given, several areas, like districts in Norway as his own. So he's united it and he has made jarl over it. So he's the second most important man in Norway to the king. And then they set off on the mythical, though non-existent, expedition to the west. Rogvald has a son called Ivar. So basically Ivar in our tongue. And Ivar is killed on the expedition to the west with King Harald Finehair. Fair hair. He's usually translated as fine hair or fair hair. Mm-hmm.
Whose son is this?
This is Rogvald of Mora, who is fighting with him. I mean, him and his eldest son have gone on this expedition. The eldest son is killed.
Right.
So as compensation, he is given Orkney and Shetland as an earldom. But he doesn't want it because it's a long way away from his lands in Norway. And he doesn't want to have to try to keep the peace in two places because, remember, it's a very, very turbulent time. There's been a big civil war. There's been lots of killing and lots of people with a grudge. So what he does is he gives it to his brother Sigurd. And Sigurd is given the title of Jarl of Orkney from the king.
So is he the first official Jarl of Orkney?
He is the very
and
first.
Shetland, right?
Yeah. At that time it was Orkney and Shetland. It was Sigurd that went campaigning in Caithness and Sutherland and subdued the lands there because Caithness was always part of the earldom of Orkney and parts of Sutherland as well. Much to the annoyance of the Scottish king. Who wouldn't have been the Scottish king at that time. He would have been the Pictish king.
Right.
Because you are talking about sort of, at this time, about 890s. Very early 890s. And so Sigurd, he teams up with a man called Thorstein the Red, and the two of them subdue the north of Scotland. Now, Sigurd, controlling the north part of Scotland, as you can imagine, that didn't always go down too well with the Picts who inhabited it. So there was one Pictish chieftain called Milbrich the Ton, or Milbrich the Tusk, or Tooth. And he was so called because he had a tooth that stuck out of his mouth like a little tusk projecting out of his gob. And they agreed to meet with 40 men. And this was agreed by both sides. They agreed on the place, the time, the men. But Sigurd thought, I don't trust the Picts. I think they'll. I think what I'll do is I'll double it. I'll take 2 men on every horse instead of 40 horses with 2 men on each one, because I suspect treachery, not realizing the irony that what he was doing was actually treachery.
Right.
But so they turn up on the side, and Melbrechta turns up with his 40 men as agreed. And he says, I see 2 sets of legs on each horse. I think that we have been played unfair. Now, Sigurd got the extra men to dismount, and then they attacked from 2 sides. And Melbrechta had said that seems they were outnumbered, that every man should try to kill at least 1 man before they died. And so there was a short, sharp, and bloody battle in which Melbrechta and all his men were killed. And then Sigurd said that they should cut off the heads of their victims and carry them on their saddle bows, on their front of their saddles, as a kind of a mark of their victory, of their triumph. And so they spur their horses and away they go. Now, Melbrechta's head was tied to the saddle of Sigurd. And so, as he spurred the horse forward, the head bumped against his leg, and the tooth caused a scratch, which turned to blood poisoning and brought about the death of Sigurd Inriki, Sigurd the Powerful, or Sigurd the Mighty. And he was buried by the River Oikel in Sutherland, and there was a big mound raised over him there. And that was the end of the first Earl of Orkney.
Serves him right.
But the interesting thing is that taking heads was not a Viking thing. That was a Celtic thing. They believed that the soul of the person and the valor of the person resided in their head. So that's why they took heads as trophies. But there is a Celtic folk tale of the severed head exacting its revenge on the person that killed it. So it may be that it was a Celtic folk tale that influenced that story in Orkneyinga Saga. And also, much later, there was a little folk tale that Ernest Marwick recorded of a man called Tusker, who was a tyrant that lived in Orkney and terrorized people and stole from them. And so the Orcadians got together and managed to drive him and his men out of the islands. But then they were worried that, what happens if they come back? So a young man set off after him to kill him, and he caught up with Tusker and killed him and cut his head off as proof and tied it to his saddle, and the tooth scratched his leg and poisoning set in. And he did return back to Kirkwall, and he held up the head so that everybody could see that their enemy that they all feared was dead, and he threw it to the crowd and then fell off the horse dead. And the people were so mad they started kicking the head around, and that was the origin of the bar game in Kirkwall. No, obviously.
Do you think that's true?
No. So much, mass football playing was common around Europe and Scandinavia, so at New Year. So no, there's no truth in it, but the fact is that was given as a folk tale, but it's based on Orkneyinga Saga.
It's done. A Celtic tale.
Which, yeah. So there you go.
These things do tend to get muddled up, don't they?
Yeah. Now, Sigurd's son, Guthorm, was then made Earl of Orkney, but he only reigned for about a year and then died in his bed. So that left the earldom vacant. Now, one thing which is kind of interesting is that Thorstein read that Sigurd had been fighting alongside his partner. He was killed before Sigurd died. His father was called Olaf the White, and he was a great chieftain in the Hebrides in the Western Isles. And he died as well, and that left his wife, Odd the Deep-Minded, or in Laxdala Saga, Un the Deep-Minded, a very wise woman. That left her with a lot of young girls, because Thorstein had a few girls, no sons. So she was in Caithness, and she had a longship built in a forest so that no one would know what she was doing. I don't know if there's many forests in Caithness. I hadn't noticed any, but I mean,
Maybe there were then.
But could have been. But anyway, the story goes that she built this longship in secret and then set off with the daughters of Thorstein, her granddaughters. She married one in Orkney, it was said, although Heimskringla says that she was married to King Dungan, or Duncan, of Duncanbehead in Caithness, and that her daughter married Thorfinn Skullsplitter and became the mother of, the matriarch of all the Earls of Orkney after that. She married another granddaughter in the Faroes, whose family became, the most powerful in the Faroes. And then the others she married in Iceland to local, powerful people. So she assured herself that her family, her bloodline, although there was no sons, that the girls were all married into the most powerful families throughout the North Atlantic. And so she then went on to have a large estate in Iceland, and was a very powerful and very highly respected woman for her wisdom. And, she was the matriarch of all these Nordic, rulers.
I like her.
So,
she's cool.
Yeah.
This isn't the point of this at all, but I do like the fact that Nordic women had a lot more rights than women just about anywhere else at that time.
They had more rights than Victorian women did in this country. Because as soon as you were married, a woman, everything that the woman owned went to her husband. It became her husband's property, as did she. Whereas in the Viking, they could keep, a good deal of their own autonomy. And
if they got a bad deal and a husband needed divorce?
Yeah, divorce was very easy. All you needed to do was to say that you are divorcing this person in front of witnesses, and that was it. You were free to go. So, and all your stuff with you. So, yeah. But women don't always get as good a press in the sagas, as we shall see. Now, this left the Earldom of Orkney wide open, and so Rogvald of Mora sends one of his sons, an illegitimate son called Halad, to Orkney. Now, at the time, Orkney was the base for a lot of Viking raiders, and he just couldn't keep control. There were people who were trying to start up, farm and fish and trade, but they were being raided by these people, and they looked to their jarl for protection, because that's what a jarl was meant to do. But he was too weak, and he ended up running off back to Norway very soon after arriving in Orkney, to great shame. So it brought great shame on him. Now, there was 2 Danish Vikings were in Orkney with the wonderful name of Thorir Treebeard and Calf Scurvy. Calf as in young cow. So Rogvald wanted one of them to go over and take over. And there is a conversation that is given in, I think it's in Land Namabok, where Rogvald's sons go to him and ask if they should go. And it appears in Orkneyinga Saga as well, but his elder son, Rolf, says, "Will I go?" And in Orkneyinga Saga, it says, "No, you're far too hot-headed and violent. You would never make a good leader." In Landnama book, it says, "No, you're destined to be a great leader elsewhere." And Rolf conquered an area in France that they called Normandy after the Northmen that had invaded it. And he ends up being kind of renamed Rollo in the lists, and he was the ancestor of William the Conqueror. So in turn, the kings of England. Rollaug also offered, but they said no. He says, your destiny lies overseas in Iceland. And Thorir the Silent, who was actually now his eldest son. I think I might have said that Rolf was his eldest. Sorry, I made a mistake. Thorir the Silent was the second son, because the oldest one, Ivar, had been killed. And he said that, "Well, should I go?" And he says, no, your destiny stays here. You will inherit the estate after me. So this left Torf Einar, who was an illegitimate son born to a slave, and he had one eye, was described as being the most ugly of men, with only one eye, but the keenest sighted of anyone. And he went to his father and he said, "Father, I will make you this offer which I think you will like. Make me the Earl of Orkney, and I promise you that I will go away and you will never have to see me again." And he said, "I like that. That's a good deal." And he says, "It's just as well that you go there, because you're not likely to make anything of yourself here, being slave-born on both sides of your mother's family." So he was given the title of Earl of Orkney, and he went over and battled Thorir Treebeard and Calfscurvy and defeated them and killed both of them and set himself up as a leader. It was said that his nickname Torf Einar, it comes from Torf, so peat, that he was meant to have been the first person to introduce peat cutting into Orkney. Cutting peat at Tarbert Ness, which is way down in Rossshire. Why? Orkney's covered in the stuff. But also, from the archaeological record, they've been burning peat here since the Neolithic. So, it was why he got the name. No idea.
But not that.
No. But everything was going fine until Rogwald of Mora, his dad, was murdered. Two sons of King Harald Finehair, who had fallen out of favour with their father because of their late mother. It's a long story. I won't go into it because this is going to take way too long anyway. But Gudrod Gleam and Halfdan Highlegs burn the house at Mora where the Jarl Rogwald is with 60 of his followers, and they're all killed in the flames. So they've sneaked up and they've set a wooden building on fire. They were jealous of the fact that he had so much power and they had none. So the king is furious, and Gudrod goes and begs forgiveness, which eventually was granted. But Halfdan Highlegs legs it over to Orkney and drives out Torf Einar, who flees to Caithness in exile, but gets men together and then goes back and defeats Halfdan at a sea battle off North Ronaldsea. Now, Halfdan escapes, but the next day they're in their ships and somebody says, "I can see something No, it was Thorfinn. It says, I can see something moving about on the island there, rising and falling, and maybe a bird, but I think it's a man. And he is then able to see, being the keenest of sight. He sees that it's Halfdan, and so they go ashore, capture him, and he kills him in one of the most gruesome ways that Vikings devised for killing their enemy. It was the blood eagle. He carved a blood eagle on his back, which is when you cut away the ribs from the spine. Man has to be alive, of course, because there's no fun if he's dead. You cut the ribs away from the spine, and you peel them back, and you draw the lungs out through the back and spread them like the wings of an eagle. And it was always considered to be an offering to the god Odin. So Odin, there is an obvious parallel going on with Thorfinn and Odin, which he then cements by making up poetry that mocks his brother Thorir the Silent for sitting silently in Mora with his ale horn and not avenging his father. And he also kind of scorns King Harald as well, saying, I've killed your son, what are you going to do about it? Ha ha. But to the listener, they would have understood the messages in that, because Thorfinn has got one eye. Odin had one eye. Odin was the keenest sighted, as Thorfinn was, and also Odin was the god of poetry. And here is Thorfinn, of course, writing poetry at the drop of a hat. So King Harald, annoyed by this, obviously, brings another great battle fleet across to Orkney. And again, Thorfinn cuts for it, but sends messengers saying that he wants to be reconciled to the king. So they agree that if he paid 60, well, he imposed a fine on the islands of 60 gold marks. And Thorfinn had said that if he paid all that himself, then the farmers in Orkney would have to, he would pay their share, but they would have to acknowledge him as superior over them and pay him taxes, pay him rent. So they agreed to that, and so it went from being an orderly society where people were in charge of their own affairs to a more feudal society where you had an overlord you had to pay tax to. So Einar dies in his bed. No more adventures after that. But he has 3 sons, Arkell, Erland, and Thorfinn Skullsplitter, who marries the great-granddaughter of Odd the Deep-Minded. So that's the...
And he gets a beer named after him.
And he gets a strong ale named after him as well. If I was going to have an ale named after me, I would want it to be a strong one too. Now, they're not out of the woods yet, because King Harald dies, and he gives the throne to his favourite son, because he's got loads of kids by loads of different women. I mean, he does marry Gerda, the beautiful daughter of King Eric of Hordaland, and they have sons together. But, he's also got mistresses on the side. He's married again. He marries the daughter of a Finn, so a Sami, who uses magic to besot him with his daughter. And then, he marries a Danish princess, and he has this son, Eric Bloodaxe. So he is put in charge of Norway. He's left as, they're supposed to rule between them, but he's a dominant one. And everybody's sick of him because he's so domineering. So he gets driven out and he comes to Orkney. And he gathers up the two elder earls, because they're all ruling jointly between them. So Arnfinn and Havard set sail down to England, and they are given territory in York. So that's where your Jorvik comes from. It was King Eric Bloodaxe was given this from King Athelstan, Anglo-Saxon king, who had been a foster father. That's another story, but again, too long. So they rule there, but he starts raiding in his neighbours because he's got a taste for the good things in life, being a king's son, and he's like a regional king, and he wants more. So there are more raids. Athelstan dies. His successor is not too fond of Norsemen. And so there's a battle in which King Eric dies, as well as Arnfinn and Havard. So that only leaves Thorfinn Skullsplitter. So Gunhild, who is Eric's wife, and his sons are in Orkney and basically take over. And Thorfinn knows that they're too powerful to fight, so he keeps in with them. You know, they're all getting along fine. The saga always portrays Gunhild as being thoroughly evil. And this comes from history being written by the side that wins. And Snorri in particular gives her extremely bad press. But then he had a personal feud with somebody who was a descendant of hers. So it's revenge. But this is what I was saying earlier, that women in the sagas, there are some that are very strong women. Most of them are just like wives of, and they hardly get a mention. But then there are the ones that stir up the trouble. And she is one of those. So when she hears that the Danish king has made an attack on Norway, she decides to get her sons over there as quick as possible and side with the Danish side to hope to be put in power, which doesn't quite go very well. But before she goes, she marries off her daughter Ragnhild to Arnfinn. Arnfinn is the oldest son of Thorfinn Skullsplitter. He's got several sons. There's Arnfinn, there's Havard, either translated as fecund or harvest happy, because he was ruled in a time that there was a good crops. There was Ljot, which is spelled A-L-J-O-T, Scully, and Hlodvar. So he's married Ragnhild off to Arnfinn. She gets fed up with him. She is being portrayed in the sagas as well as being thoroughly evil and very much a chip off the old block when it comes to her mother. And so she is fed up with Arnfinn, so she manages to contrive his murder in Caithness. And then she marries Harvest Happy, her former brother-in-law. She's working her way through these brothers. This is why it's important to get the names in. Now she gets fed up with him as well. So she goes to his nephew, who is the son of a sister of, because they don't actually mention who the sisters were. Again, it's one of those things that unless women have children that come into it, then they're kind of written out the sagas, which is a great shame. But he's got a nephew, Harvest Happy, has got a nephew called Einar Butterbread. And so Ragnhild persuades him to battle with his uncle and to take control of the earldom of Orkney, and promises to marry him as well if he does that. Now, obviously, from an uncle and a nephew, might think a bit of an age difference, but of course you have to remember that women were married off quite young in those days, so it's not unusual to have like a 12-year-old bride. So there may have not been a huge amount of difference between the ages of the uncle and the nephew here. But so she gets Einar Butterbread to have a battle with Harvest Happy, which takes place in Stennis. Don't know where, but somewhere in Stennis. And there's a bloody battle, and in which the Havard is killed by Einar. So that's fine. She'd promised to marry him, but then she kind of thought, nah. So she went to another Einar Hardmouth, who was a cousin of Einar Butterbread. And this is where it gets confusing, because you got two Einars here. So she goes, to another guy, saying, that guy I promised to marry, he's your cousin, you should avenge the killing of your uncle. And if you do, I might just marry you. So there is a battle between them in which Einar Butterbread is killed. So you've got old Einar Hardmouth there, is thinking he's going to now marry Ragnhild, but instead of that, she marries Ljot, the other brother. So she's done 3 brothers, and she's wiped out a couple of nephews. So she's always portrayed as being like this kind of Black Widow spider, killing her mates at the middle of a web of intrigue. But it may not actually be that a fair representation, because she was the daughter of a king. And as such, she comes with, a reputation, a pedigree. People like to be married to people who have powerful, fathers or grandfathers. So it's a feather in their cap to be linked to the kings in Norway. So maybe it was actually the men that were battling out over control of this woman, rather the woman trying to set them up against each other as this evil schemer, which is how she's portrayed in the sagas.
Even if she did, though, that's no different than the way that the men were behaving and betraying and killing and slaying each other.
Absolutely. The one thing that I'm intrigued of is that Jarl Ljot, L-J-O-T, as I said, bit of a mouthful, Ljot, he ends up being married to this scheming woman, Ragnhild. In Arthurian legends, there is King Lot of Orkney, who is married to one of the sisters of Arthur. Can't remember which one offhand now, but
Morgaine and...
Yeah. You see, the thing is, we really need to get Simon Haywood in here to talk about it. We need an Arthurian expert. Now, it might have nothing. It might have nothing to do with it whatsoever. The fact that Ljot, the Earl of Orkney, was maybe remembered in Britain as being powerful leader, married to a woman who was rather tainted with the deaths of all her previous husbands, who were all related. So you've got kind of powerful leader with dodgy wife. That's kind of what you got in the Arthurian legends as well. they may have never heard of him. I don't know, but it could have just been that legend. And also, it's one of those things of, where's the furthest away you can think of? Well, I've heard of this place called Orkney.
Far, far away.
Yeah. So it's about as far away as you can imagine if you are a medieval person living in England,
Right.
or Wales, or Scotland. I mean, there are Arthurian legends that are all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something to sit down with Simon and have a chat about someday, I think. But anyway, they all die eventually, leaving one. Well, there was Scully, but he disappears, never to be heard of again. So there's Hlodver, and he has a son called Sigurd. And so it's Sigurd that becomes Earl of Orkney. And he's married twice. He has 3 sons by his first wife, and then he marries a daughter of King Malcolm of Scotland, and has another son called Thorfinn, who we will come to in another episode, because he was the first Christian Jarl of Orkney. Sigurd Digri, Sigurd the Stout, was the last pagan Earl of Orkney. And he has quite a story behind him, but you won't find it in Orkneyinga Saga.
Oh, it's not in there.
Orkneyinga Saga says very little about him. I mean, remarkably little about him. It just says that it says about the first couple of stories I'm going to tell you about him. But then it's just like, and he was killed in Ireland in 1014. And it's like, that's it. Where you get the most of the story of that from is from another great classic Icelandic saga called Njal Saga. And Njal is a man of great importance, wealth, and also wisdom. He can prophesize things in the future. But anyway, we won't get into that. But it is the most classic. It's a huge saga. It's one I think that they still teach in schools in Iceland.
So is that another one that you would recommend?
Oh, well, I'd recommend all of them. I'd also recommend highly Orkneyinga Saga, as long as you remember you're reading a story about a family over 300 years. But anyway, so Sigurd inherits the title of Jarl, and it's all kind of coming apart at the seams, because over in Caithness, there's uprisings against him, and he needs to fight with the Scots. We are looking here at very early 990s AD, and he has a challenge issued to him by a Jarl called Finlake in Scotland. And he wants to meet him at a place called Skittenmire, which is just outside of Wick. And they are to meet there on a certain day. And he knows that he's got no hope of beating this army, because they are outnumbered 7-1. There is no way that he's going to win that. So what does any man do? Goes to see his mammy.
Mm-hmm.
And his mother, Ethne, is daughter of a king in Ireland. And she is also known as being a very powerful sorceress. So he goes to see her and he says, can you do something, use your powers to help me to win this battle? Because this is absolutely unwinnable, and I need your help in order to win it. And she says to him rather sort of caustically that if I thought that you wanted to live forever, I would have reared you in my wool basket, she says. It's not what a man does, it's fate that decides your future. But I have made you something with all the skill and power that I have. And she brings out a beautiful raven banner. So it's a banner with a raven embroidered on it, that when it is flown in front of the army in battle, it looks like the raven is flying before them in battle. And the raven is obviously associated with Odin. And she says that this will bring victory to the side that carries it into battle, but death to the man who holds the standard. So the standard bearer will die, and they were seen as being a sacrifice to Odin. So angrily he takes his banner and goes off in the huff because, he was getting kind of, chided at by his mum. But they go and fight, and amazingly enough, he wins the battle, outnumbered though they were. But he loses 3 standard bearers, and they were, of course, the sacrifice to Odin. But they win the day. Mm. Now, in 995, he's lying at Osmondswa, and I know, I'm sorry to folk in Waz listening to this that says that's not how it's pronounced. I ken that there's a local pronunciation for it, but I just can't remember what it is. But it's written like Osmond's Wall, but wow, it was a bay. But it is just off where the cemetery on South Waz is. Mm. And in that bay there, you had Sigurd with 3 longships waiting for favourable tides to cross the Pentland Firth. Because obviously crossing the Firth is you can't just head off whenever you feel like it in a sailing ship. You got to go with the wind and the tides. And so he was waiting for those. When 5 longships sail into the bay, and this is Olaf Tryggvason, who is a contender for the crown in Norway. And he had been fighting down in England, and he'd been wounded, and he was healed by a hermit on the Scilly Isles. And he was converted to Christianity. And like any convert, he was a true zealot. So he was going around trying to make everybody else a Christian as well, with a very persuasive argument. Become a Christian or become a corpse. It's up to you. So
it's not the way I heard it's supposed to be done.
Well, Sigurd was invited over to the longship, went over with his son, and King Olaf Tryggvason said, right, either you accept Christianity or I will go through the Isles with steel and flames and kill everybody. So he said, okay, where do I sign? And he accepted baptism from the king, who then took his eldest son as a hostage. Now, it's said in Orkneyinga Saga that the boy's name was either Hundi or Whelp, which means, a hound or whelp, a puppy. But then King Olaf gave him the name Hlodvar. Now, that's bollocks, quite frankly, because his grandfather was called Hlodvar. He's the eldest son. It's a coincidence that King Olaf chose the name of his grandfather if he was just called Hound or Puppy, And who the hell calls their kids Hound and Puppy anyway, Maybe it's like a pet name, nickname, but, Anyway, so he sets sail for Norway. He becomes king in 995, but is defeated in 1000 in a battle against the Danes. So King Olaf Tryggvason.
The threatening new Christian.
He had a party piece of running along the oars of a longship as the guys were rowing. He could run along
From
the oars.
one to the other.
Yeah.
Wow.
But anyway, it didn't save him.
This is quite a trick, though.
Yeah, it's
impressive.
Yeah, it's good if you can do it. So, but then when he is killed in 1000, Sigurd just tears up the contract, goes back to the Raven Banner, and he's pagan again. I mean, you find in Orkneyinga Saga that there's references in the 12th century to there's a guy called Svein Brestrop who sits out all night raising trolls. He's raising ghosts and such like to try to learn magic from them in a pagan practice, and which the bishop doesn't like much. But it shows that Christianity may have been accepted as a religion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody practiced it. There were still people practicing the old religion, especially when Orkney was such a cultural crossroads. You're getting people coming and going, you know. But anyway, he's ruling away, doing fine. No more trouble in Caithness. And then in Yule 1013, he gets a visit from a guy called Sigtryg Silkbeard, who was the king of Dublin. And he wants to raise a force to fight the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, who had, for a short time, been his father-in-law. He was married to his mother, but then she got the bum's rush, and, you know, and there was a lot of ill feeling. And so, as part of a deal, Sigtryg says to him that if you agree to support me, I will give you my mother's hand in marriage, because apparently she was a very beautiful woman. And also, I will give you the title of king in Ireland, like the High King title. So, being a guy that is fond of power and wealth and such like, he says, oh yeah, easily seduced, you know, oh yeah, I'll do that. And so an army is raised. Now, meanwhile, Sigtryg, who is not the most honest of guys, goes off to a Viking called Broder, who is a real nutjob. He's a real psychopath. And Broder, he was originally ordained as a mass priest, hence the name Broder, which just means brother. So he was a priest who then abandoned it and took up sorcery. So he's, again, pagan, but, you know, dabbles in the black arts as well. Now he goes to Broder and says to him, will you support my campaign to try to defeat King Brian Boru in Ireland? If you do, I'll give you my mother's hand in marriage, and, you know, we'll talk about kingships later. Now, he likes this, Broder. But he is acting along with a man called Ospak, who is another Viking leader. He's got 20 longships under him, and Broder has 30 longships under him, full of men. Now, that night, there was a terrible noise suddenly, or, you know, began, like in the air above them, that kind of shook the earth. And then blood started to rain down on Broder's longships. And it was scalding hot blood that burnt a lot of men. A lot of them were badly scalded with it. They held shields above their heads to try to protect them. But in the morning, when it stopped at sunrise, there was one man dead on every ship. 30 ships. That night, the same noise. And this time, all the weapons jumped up into the air by themselves and started to battle each other. The axes and the swords and the spears all started fighting, and then they turned on the crew, and the crew had to defend themselves as best they could against basically their own weapons. But many of them were grievously wounded, and in the morning, one man on every ship was dead. On the third night, again the noise began, and there was monstrous ravens attacked the ships, huge ravens with beaks and claws of iron. And they tore at the men who tried to defend themselves, and again there was many badly injured. And in the morning, again, one man on each ship was dead. So Broder went to see Ospak, who was known to be a very wise man and who had the gift of second sight. And he asked him what these omens meant. Now, Ospak knew that Broder was a man of habit, and he had certain taboos that he wouldn't breach. And the one thing was he would never fight at night. So he said, I'll have to think about that for a while. I'll give you an answer this evening. So he waited until it was dark. And then he told him that the noise that he had marked like the end of the world. It was a sound that he was going to be involved in a great battle that would tear the country apart. The blood, the scalding hot blood, was for his own blood and the blood that he would shed in a battle that was coming. The weapons fighting by themselves showed that he would take part in a great battle. And the ravens represented the demons from hell that came to carry away his soul. Oh. Now, Broder didn't like that answer, as Ospak knew he wouldn't. But he also knew that he wouldn't attack him at night, but he knew that the ships would attack in the morning. And he tried to prevent them from leaving the bay, but they were able to cut the ropes that were to keep them in, and managed to escape and went to Ireland to King Brian Boru, and Ospak offered to fight with him in his army. So they set sail for Ireland, and they arrived. And being a man versed in the black arts, he knew that if they attacked on Good Friday, then they would ultimately lose. Brian Boru would win the battle, but Brian Boru would die. And if they attacked earlier, then they would all be killed. And Brian Boru didn't want to fight on Good Friday because that was a holy day, and he was not going to break such a holy day but with violence. So he stayed at the back behind a wall of shields to protect him. Now, they arrived, and like I said, they drew up for battle on Good Friday, the 23rd of April, 1014. And the army was positioned in such a way that Jarl Sigurd Digri, Sigurd the Stout, had the central part of the army. He led from the centre. On the one side there was Sigtryg Silkbeard leading his men, and Broder leading his on the other wing. And of course the magic raven banner was unfurled, and they went into battle. And Broder was protected by his cloak, which no weapon could pierce. And he cut his way through the warriors till he got to Ulf, the brother of Brian Boru. Ulf just means wolf. And he wasn't able to kill him because of the cloak that protected him. But he was able to knock him flat on his back. And Broder, like many bullies, was a coward at heart. And he fled the battlefield with some of his men and went into hiding in the woods. Now, the battle was very, very fierce, and I mean, many men were dying on both sides, and 3 standard bearers had been cut down. And there's different versions of a story. The one says there was a man called Amundi the White. When he had asked an Icelandic poet called Thorstein Siduhalsson to pick up the banner. But he was warned, don't pick that up, says Amundi. I've lost 3 sons carrying that banner. And again, there's another version that says it was someone else, and he says, bear your own devil, Errol. So Sigurd says, a beggar and his partial do not go separately. And he pulled the banner off the pole and he rolled it up and hid it under his clothes. And soon after that, he was run through with a spear and killed. And the Irish side won the day. King Brian Boru's side won the day. Now, this is often said as being a battle of like pagan Vikings versus Christian Irish. It wasn't. You know, it's like Culloden wasn't Scots versus English. It was Scots versus other Scots and English. It's not quite as black and white as that. There was pagans on both sides. There was Christians on both sides. It was just over control of Ireland rather than, it wasn't a religious war.
Mm-hmm.
But so they win the battle, King Brian Boru. And Broder, meanwhile, is still hiding in the woods with some of his men, and he can see that as the army surges forward, King Brian is left at the rear with his shield army, this wall of shields around him from his bodyguards. So him and his men run up and cut their way through the shield wall and kill King Brian. They said that they took his head off at one stroke of the sword. And the men are so, furious, of course, that they get branches of trees.
This is Brian's men.
Yeah. And they surround Broder and his men, and they push against them with the branches so that they can't move, they can't get at them with their weapons, so they can be taken alive. And all of Broder's men are executed. But then Ulf, the brother of King Brian, decides on the death that Broder should have. And he chose a real doozy. He had his belly sliced open, and then he took out his entrails and fastened them to an oak tree. And then he was led round and round and round the tree until all his intestines were wound out. And they said that he didn't die until the last of his intestines was pulled from his body.
Jeez.
But Brian was supposed to be so holy that when his head was picked up and taken back and placed on the neck again, the 2 halves fused together and he became whole again. Now, there's a couple of footnotes to this one. There's one of a man called Dormad in Caithness who sees a group of 12 people all riding towards a little shack that was used by women for weaving in. And curious, he goes and peeps through a window and he sees a terrible sight, because these were women, but they weren't just any women. They were the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain in battle. And they were weaving cloth, but not of wool. They used human entrails. And the loom was 2 spears stuck into the ground. And the warp and the weft was human entrails. There was human heads as loom weights, and they were using an arrow as a shuttle and a sword as a weaving batten to beat the wefts down. And as they did that, they sang a song. And it was directing the course of the battle and the deaths of the people that was going to die there that day. And when they had finished, they each tore the cloth from the womb and... Did I say womb?
Loom.
I meant loom. They tore the cloth from the loom and they tore it into 12 parts. And then they jumped on their horses and they rode off in different directions. Now, there was an old warrior called Harak that wanted to go and fight with Sigurd. He was an old retainer, an old warrior that had always fought with him. And Sigurd said, no, he was too old now to fight. But he said, you stay here, and I promise you, you will be the first to know the outcome of the battle. And after Sigurd was killed, his army was seen to return. There was these men on horseback, led by Sigurd, that came riding in Orkney. And Harak saw them, and he took a horse and rode out to meet them. And he stopped and spoke for a time with Sigurd. And then they all turned their horses around and they rode away again and disappeared behind a hill and were never seen again. Because this was a ghostly army coming back to tell the old man what had happened, and he had chosen to go with them. So that was the stories of the pagan jarls of Orkney. Obviously, the next episode, whenever that will be the Christian ones, which of course will include St. Magnus and the building of the cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of that at the moment, but...
That's all very, it's thrilling. The stories are awful, but thrilling.
Yeah. I mean, they're certainly not without their, they're gruesome, but they're not without some appeal as well, it's interesting. But the sagas were, becoming popular in the Victorian age.
Yeah.
So,
did you want to talk more about that, or is that for the next one?
I suppose I could. Icelandic sagas, they were disappearing and they were going all over the place, and there was the King of Denmark, who at the time was ruling both Denmark and Norway. This is in the 18th century. Was getting people to travel around and to look for manuscripts in Iceland. And they were brought back and kept in the royal treasury. There was a story of another great classic, a great epic, like Njal Saga, which was claimed to have been even better than Njal Saga. But who can say that? Because it's lost. And the reason it was lost was because it was eaten during a time of famine. Because the books were made of vellum, so they were made of calf skin. And they boiled that up and ate it because there was no food.
So sad in so many ways.
So there was that. But in the mid-19th century, there was a guy called Samuel Lang of Pabdale in Kirkwall, who had made rather a bad deal with James Bakey and Tanquenas because he'd bought half a eddy off him. The island of Eddy, which Lang owned the one half and Bakey owned the other half. And so he sold it to him because it was good kelp shore. So they were going to make kelp from the seaweed and make them, because that was making them a fortune. And he bought it just in time for the industry to collapse because cheap imports from Europe was coming in. And so they didn't need it anymore. It was really time of war during the Napoleonic Wars when imports were just not available. And so he lost a lot of money. So he ended up fleeing creditors and going into hiding. living in a small village in Norway just outside Trondheim. And when he was there, he bought a copy of Heimskringla, Snorri's History of the Kings in Norway, which would have been in Danish, and he translated it from Danish into English. And that was published in Britain in 1844, and it was the first translation of Heimskringla. And it became a rip-roaring success because, there were stories in that took place in Britain. And it was the first time that the British had heard stories from the sagas set in their own countries. And it became a bit of an obsession. And Queen Victoria herself declared that she was descended from the great legendary hero Ragnar Lodbrok. Ragnar, hairy breeks, hairy breeches. So everybody was getting in on the scene.
Just to clarify, she had no reason to actually say that, did she?
Well, I mean, he's a bit of a mythical character, he may have existed, he may not, I don't know, but
she could just say whatever she wanted to.
Yeah, she was queen.
Yeah.
Yeah, who's going to argue? There won't be any...
But then that set the fashion, didn't it? Everybody else wanted to be descended from Vikings, too.
Yeah, a lot of which was based on racism, because... they all knew about the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and all that, and what they didn't want to be was Celtic, because that was considered to be inferior. So, like Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland was not considered as good as. So, yeah, just complete racism. Hitler used it during the war as well, and, when they invaded Denmark and Norway, they had recruiting posters up with an SS soldier in profile, a painting of an SS soldier in profile, with a Viking warrior in profile as well next to him, showing that we are all Aryan. And so join with us in the fight against these inferior Untermenschen, undermen, subhumans. So, yeah, it's been going on, still going on, sadly. But, yeah, so it became a big thing in the Victorian age. And then that's when you get Orkneyinga Saga being translated for the first time was in 1873, it was a Icelander, Jon A. Hjaltalin and Gilbert Gowdy was the two translators. But there was an introduction written by Joseph Anderson, who was the keeper of the archaeology collection at the National Museum of Scotland. And he wrote an extremely long introduction and loads of footnotes. And they also cut out all the beginning of the saga as well. It just comes straight in at, like the mythological bit is binned, and you've got King Harald then giving the title of Jarl to Rogvald, who then gives it to his brother Sigurd, who then dies. But it doesn't say anything about the tooth or anything like that, because probably too gory. And it then just sort of skips from there to Thorfinn, and it skips to...
What translation is that then?
Well, this is the first one, yeah. It was then translated again in 1894 by Sir George Dasent, who was also translated Norwegian folk tales as well into English. He was the first translator of Asbjørnsen and Moe. And in 1938, Alexander B. Taylor did a translation, which when you read the poetry of George Mackay Brown, that's the translation that he uses. He draws inspiration from that because it came out in 1938. And so at that time, he would have been, 17? So that was the version that was available. And that was the version that he had. Because you can see it in some of the writings. You can tell it's Taylor's translation. It's a good translation, mind you.
There's still somebody translating today, isn't there?
Mhm.
Just
Well,
came out or is about to come out?
in 1978, there's Herman Paulson and Paul Edwards did the most recent translation, which is, still available in as a Penguin classic.
Mm.
But Judith Chesh has apparently completed a translation, but is now writing an introduction to it, was the last I heard.
To the Orkneyinga Saga.
Yeah. So that would be interesting to see, because everybody takes in a slightly different meaning. And because words can be translated in different ways. And so it'd be interesting to see how her translation varies from the others. But I'm proud to say I've got first editions of all of them, and I've got my working copies that I use and such like. So, but it's a very, very important part of Orkney's cultural heritage, because when I was young, I bought a copy. It was the 1873 translation, but it was like republished in the 70s. And I read that with a map of Orkney with me, because I have to admit that at that time I was kind of ignorant in, many things, most things. So I was following where the action was taking place around Orkney. And that was fascinating. So it's something that's fascinated me ever since. I wrote a couple of wee books on it. I did a shorter Orkneyinga Saga as part of an EU project. And also Orkney in the Sagas, which was drawing on about 17 different Icelandic sagas and medieval histories as well, to tell the story of Orkney through the sagas, but pointing out that sagas, while they're a good read, and many of them are, they're maybe based on real events or real people, but it's like a historical novel written about that person. You don't know what they said. Mm-hmm. You don't know what they were thinking, So it can't be taken as pure history, and it shouldn't be. But that was just a way for me to try to encourage people to pick up sagas and read them, because they're fabulous,
Those two books that you wrote, the shorter ones, are now out of print.
Oh, yeah, they've been out of print for quite a while.
Since we now run a press, maybe we should do something about that.
Well, what I would want to do is to sit down and rewrite them. Actually, I wouldn't just... Well, that was done at work, but all the research was done at home. But basically, it's still not my copyright. But it could be redone, because the Orkneyinga Sagas one used to sell quite well. So,
well, people can let us know if they would like to see something like that.
Be interested to hear what people think. If you would be interested in reading a condensed version of Orkneyinga Saga, which was purely, it was aimed at kids. And there was copies given to all the schools in Orkney, free.
Minus the blood eagles and things like that, presumably. And the guts going around the tree.
Well, no, that's not in Orkneyinga Saga, so I can't remember, to be quite honest. But I may have not gone too gory, but of course kids love gore.
They do, it's true. Kids are little ghouls.
Anyway, I think I've probably blathered on for long enough about that. I don't know how long that's been now, but
long enough.
Too long.
I think we should stop for now. And we will probably be speaking with somebody fascinating for our next podcast, but soon we'll do a part 2 of this and carry on from the medieval days, St. Magnus.
Rogvald and this cathedral and all.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thanks for listening. And thank you at home as well. I hope that you got something out of that. I kind of feel it's just like a long kind of ramble, like Grandpa Simpson, but,
Well, there are a lot of names and battles and things. There's no getting around that if you're trying to give sort of a more or less succinct version of what happens in the Orkneyinga Saga, what it what it means, why it's important. So hopefully we've scratched the surface of that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
More next time.
Okay. Right. Bye then.